support some local Indigenous businesses. That's a big way to be an ally. Another way is to take care of the land. And that doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to mean getting involved in an activist agency. Sometimes it just means picking up trash in the ditch. Sometimes that's the way we show that we respect Mother Earth. Another way is to watch our water conservation or recycle better or things like that. So how we treat the land and how we treat its people are huge first steps. And lastly, I just want to say that the ways in which we walk into the world with egocentrism, deciding that what I know is best and what everyone else thinks is wrong, that's what started this mess. And so I think the biggest way to be an ally is to work on what's happening in here and what's happening in here, and to do our own inner work, do our own inner healing, do our own inner deconstructing that needs to get done, to get to a place where we can actually make eye contact with someone of a different culture and a different faith and say, namaste. The light in me recognizes, identifies with, and respects the light in you. I think that might be perhaps step one. Orange Shirt Day is on Tuesday. Every child matters. It's a day in Canada where we remember the atrocities of cultural genocide that happened to our Indigenous people through residential schools. Children were kidnapped and stolen from their families and forced into boarding schools. Their hair was cut, their clothes were burned, they were physically, sexually, and emotionally abused. Their culture was stripped away from them, and then they were returned to their communities where their parents had become very broken people. And these children were taught how to parent by abusive dorm parents like my grandmother. And as a result, when those children had children, the only way that they knew how to parent was by being abusive. And they were obviously dealing with a lot of complex trauma. And so they themselves often struggled with drug and alcohol abuse just to cope with life. As a result, in the 1960s, there was a movement called the 60s Scoop. The 60s Scoop is when all these children that went to residential schools did not know how to parent. And so a lot of children, almost an entire generation of children, were apprehended from their homes and put into white homes. It was another form of cultural genocide. It wasn't a residential school, it was kidnapping. Children were taken from Indigenous homes, put into white homes. I have aunts and uncles that fostered Indigenous children during the 60s Scoop. That is a part of the Canadian history that I identify with. What also happened during that time that is not talked about is forced sterilization. Indigenous women who would go in to have a birth would be put under, and they would have a hysterectomy, or they would have their tubes tied and not be told. That forced sterilization continued right up until the time that I was doing social work, which was in the early 2000s. As a social worker, I was told and encouraged to get every single one of my foster girls that were having a menstrual cycle to get on the depot shot, which is an injection of birth control that lasts for about 6 months. This is something that was regularly told to us to encourage. And that is, I believe, a continuation of forced sterilization. This is not old. The last residential school only closed in the 1990s. The 1990s. This is not old history. This is recent history. It takes about 7 generations to heal. So when you hear Uncle Abe going around saying, I don't know what they're still complaining about, that was a long time ago and they can't, feel free to shut him up and let him know it's not old history. And healing takes 7 generations. And it's our job as allies to sit beside, to hold hands, to cry with, to grieve with, to be angry with, to walk alongside in the marches, to shop and support local Indigenous businesses, and to show up with empathy, and also to do our own inner work. So there's lots we can do right now as people with colonial history that help move the needle forward, that help push us into breaking generational trauma, both on the Indigenous side and the white side, so that someday in the future, we can come together in a form of healing, join hands and say, let's become Indigenous to place together. We're not there yet. We are still in a stage of grieving and healing, but there are things we can do right now to help that needle move forward. Much love.